T+A Elektroakustic is a venerable German company with extensive engineering and manufacturing capabilities for speakers, amplifiers, D-to-A converters, turntables, and headphones. We've done a complete profile of the company based on a visit to their headquarters, and I invite you to check that out if you want more of the background on the philosophy of T+A. T+A, by the way, stands for Theory plus Application. Siegfried Amft is the managing director of the company, and he got his start designing loudspeakers after studying acoustics under Fritz Sennheiser at university. From our discussions, he loves loudspeaker design. His desk is next to an anechoic chamber and a Klippel robot. And T+A uses some unusual technologies in their speakers. Top-of-the-line solitaire models employ tall ribbon tweeters and use oval mid-range drivers. The Criterion Series S240, which is our review subject, are part of the T+A Criterion range of speakers, each of which uses transmission line loading for the bass drivers. Let's see what all this experience and technology delivers.
Do what I do. I'm really here on my ones now instead of 4 3s or 2s. And now it's F you from Paris. I could have been F'ing you in Paris.
Note, in this series, we examine candidates for the best speakers between 10k and 20k. The backstory for covering the T+A Criterion S240 starts with transmission line bass. Transmission line bass loading has been around for a long time, but it's been deployed relatively rarely because it's complex and thus costly. It's historically been hard to model until recently as well, but the benefits are rather clear. Like ported designs, transmission lines reinforce low-frequency output by adding the rear wave of the woofers rather than just absorbing it. Even more than ported designs, transmission lines can limit woofer excursion in certain ranges. Transmission lines have other advantages over ported or bass reflex designs. The transmission line resonances can be distributed over a wider range of frequencies instead of lumped into a single peak. This can improve articulation. Also, the long, damped transmission line tunnel can effectively absorb upper bass and lower mid-range frequencies so that these do not escape the cabinet and color the sound. In some ways, a transmission line system is in between a sealed box design and a ported design, with some of the advantages of each. A transmission line behaves more like a closed design because it utilizes standing waves in the cabinet damping the woofer resonances depending on the length, and not allowing the resonance to affect sonic character as it does in a bass reflex cabinet. T+A has been building transmission line speakers for nearly its entire 47-year history and continues to believe in the value of this approach to speaker design. Historically, transmission line designs have allowed a distinctive sonic profile in the low and mid bass that many listeners have at times found beguiling. If you're interested in some of this history, check out our discussion on this channel of the IMF reference standard monitors from the 1970s. If Helen of Troy had the face that launched 1,000 ships, IMF had the bass that launched 1,000 audiophiles. The Criterion S240 uses 2 9-inch bass drivers loaded into the line. Then 2 6-inch mid-range drivers take over. These are in an MTM array with a 1-inch dome tweeter in the middle. The arrangement of the drivers, along with a complex crossover and integrated baffle, are designed to carefully control the radiation pattern to reduce the influence of room reflections and yield improved imaging. The woofer and mid-range cones are made of specially shaped amorphous wood fiber material said to improve dynamics by improving damping and increasing stiffness. The cabinet is naturally stiffened by the complex transmission line, along with strategic bracing. The speakers are 48 inches high by 15 inches wide by 20 inches deep. They weigh 121 pounds each. Price is $17,990 per pair in the US. 4 finishes are available: the matte black of our review pair, Arctic silver, matte white, and Macassar wood. All right, let's talk about sound quality. I like technology, but mostly we're here to talk about sound quality. A quick reminder is that my job is to objectively observe what the product does, using the absolute sound as a reference that we can share. Based on this, you will need to judge whether the particular strengths and weaknesses of the product are likely to suit your musical needs and sensitivities. As you may know, I like to concentrate first on the outstanding aspects of SQ for each product. If these aren't interesting to you, there's really no point in going further. On the other hand, if something here sounds special, you're encouraged to go check it out. I used very high-quality electronics for this review. The block mono A amplifiers with 200 watts in Class A and 500 watt Class AB capability, along with the Berkeley Audio Alpha DAC Reference Series 3P and the Aurender N20 streamer. Listening was conducted in my purpose-built 4,400 cubic foot room. All right, quality number one, full range dynamics. The dynamic capability of the S240 is impressive. On a significant number of tracks with some percussive elements, I noticed that the S240 simply seemed less compressed than other speakers in the price range, and frankly above it. Take the new Henry Threadgill album, Listen Ship. The piano hammer strikes just jump out of the soundstage unrestrained, as they do in a live performance if you're seated in the front rows. The attractive thing about this capability with the S240 is that there's little sense that the drivers are performing some kind of a trick where you get the impact, but you also get the distortions of drivers out of control, overshooting their assigned goal. That's not what's happening here. It just sounds natural, but definitely attention-getting, like the real thing. This dynamism extends into the bass. On album after album, I wrote the word punchy about the bass performance. Kick drums and electric bass have a sense of power and aliveness that again is reminiscent of live performances, when the sound isn't mangled by the PA or excessive levels. The Cindy Blackman Santana track, Imagine, from the album Give the Drummer Some, is a good, non-audiophile recording that demonstrates top-to-bottom dynamism on the S240. Now, to put this in some context, I think electrostatic speakers offer more impressive dynamics in the upper mid-range and treble. The problem in my experience is that electrostats don't have the dynamic coherence top-to-bottom that the S240 does. So electrostats do some interesting things, but those can leave you wanting that dynamism to extend into the bass and lower mid-range. In contrast, I think the S240 sounds dynamically coherent, or as we say, believable, with reference to the absolute sound because their dynamics are analogous to what you hear with real instruments across the board. I think horn-loaded speakers can also have this quality of, wow, the dynamics are impressive, but somehow not right, because many horn speakers confine their dynamics to a particular range. I'm generalizing to help you understand the dynamic accomplishment that the S240 represents, at least with a somewhat beefy amplifier. I never got the sense that the S240 needed to explore the limits of the amps I was using, but I listen at pretty sane levels that I cap at about 85 dB average for physiological reasons and to allow high dynamic range. Next, let's talk about quality number two, bass weight and texture. Now this brings us to the aspect of the S240 that experienced audiophiles may be expecting. The mid and low bass of the S240 is a standout element of their performance, but you need to know some details. First, referencing work from B&K and Harman and others, listeners indicate a preference for elevated bass levels compared to mid-range levels, and the apparent preference is for smoothly rising output as frequency falls. 30 Hz is a little above 60, which is a little above 120 Hz, which is a little above 240, and so on. Despite awareness of this, relatively few speakers seem to follow this model. I would say the S240 roughly does, and thus it's different. Based on my measurements, output rises from the upper mid-range as frequency goes down into the low bass. This range covers about 7 octaves, and output rises by about 8 dB, which is approximately the 1 dB per octave Harman curve. So relative to many other speakers, the S240 has slightly elevated mid-bass and low bass to a degree. It starts to roll off in the low 30 Hz region. Note that the desired bass curve is not clearly defined, but is often said to rise at about 1 dB per octave as frequency falls. So 30 Hz would be 1 dB louder than 60 Hz, and 60 Hz would be 1 dB louder than 120 Hz. 1 dB is tiny compared to the ups and downs in bass output caused by your room, but when two speakers have different balance in this region, you will notice it. Whether the S240 output is synergistic with your room problems is much harder to say, but my sense is that many audiophiles want about what the S240 output profile delivers. Now, we also want to talk about bass quality, not just bass level. The nice thing about the S240 is that the bass is meaty and punchy, as I said in the section on dynamics, but it also has texture. It isn't a one-note thing where a lot of instruments sound the same. That said, I don't think the S240 is the last word in bass definition. If you've followed my comments with various products on the topic of octave-to-octave balance, you'll know that experienced listeners often know when an instrument doesn't sound quite right because harmonics are slightly or significantly out of balance with fundamentals. The S240 has a slight tendency to emphasize fundamentals, hence the comment on bass definition. It may be that this is a case of you can't have your cake and eat it too, in the sense that you can't do listener-preferred tone shaping and retain maximum bass definition. Reality is a harsh mistress. All right, quality number 3, treble clarity and smoothness. The mid-range and treble of the S240 exhibits an admirable level of clarity. A core element of clarity done right can be called instrumental separation. This just means that each performer can be heard distinctly. Some listeners describe this as sounding as if there's air or space around each performer. The result is that you can follow musical lines more easily. The S240 does this quite well. If you spend twice as much, or if you simply want to maximize this quality, you can slightly improve on the S240, but I think most listeners would count this kind of clarity as a strength. That sense of clarity as strength is amplified because the S240 is not a bright speaker, nor is it a dull speaker. What I want to emphasize is that the S240 doesn't seem to derive its sense of clarity with some tricks like peaky treble. This makes the clarity of the speaker enjoyable on a wider range of recordings, although on a few tracks from the 80s and 90s, the S240, of course, reveals the train wreck that was occurring in some studios as they transitioned to the digital era. Again, no tricks. Quality number 4 is imaging scale. The imaging of the S240 is impressive, but again, this needs to be characterized. First off, the S240 does an admirable job of getting the image off the speakers and floating in space. The success, or not, of the S240 image then comes in its ability to present large-scale works as large and small-scale works as small. Lots of speakers can do small scale, but it turns out that the scale is always smallish. And some people love this character when it's accompanied by very detailed performer placement left to right and front to back. That isn't the main thing that the S240 imaging is up to. Instead, it draws your attention to the size and shape of the imaging canvas. The performers are believably positioned if you know live music because the positioning is almost never at millimeter level in concert. Now, just as with digital artifacts, the S240 can't correct for recordings with weak imaging. What I'm describing as a strength is a strength with good source material. I compared Shostakovich symphonic works recordings on Deutsche Grammophon and reference recordings, and the imaging differences were Night, DGG, and Day, reference recordings. I also checked imaging outside the sweet spot for group listening. This isn't something that the stereo architecture is really designed to do, but that doesn't mean you don't want it. In the event, I would say the S240 does a good but not great job here. I might be slightly overcritical here because of the ability of the S240 to do large-scale images in the sweet spot. So you notice the difference more when you're off-axis than with speakers that tend towards small images all the time. Siggy Amf tells me that all current T+A speakers are designed specifically to focus most critically on the sweet spot by carefully controlling and reducing first reflections from ceiling, floor, and sidewalls. This is accomplished by using integrated driver and cabinet designs that include waveguides for each driver. While this accomplishes the task of focusing the music at the listening position, it also makes listening far off axis less focused than with some other speaker designs. But it's managed so that the speakers retain the scope and harmonic character of the recording. All right, now, I said I'd talk about strengths first, then let's talk about trade-offs. Since every product has trade-offs, I've talked about some of the trade-offs in the comments on outstanding qualities. But stepping back to a macro perspective, you might wonder what you would get if you spent more. I think this comes down to two things not covered so far. The first is you could get a better rendering of small-scale signals. The S240 has a very slight sense of veiling compared to speakers at twice the price, and compared with the absolute sound. I think for many listeners, this would fall in the category of you don't miss it without direct comparison, But if you really prize that sense of nothing between you and the signal, you'll want to try the S240 before you buy. The S240 also has a small sense of octave-to-octave variation. This is quite small and mostly shows up as slight variations in the character of the bass or mid-range or treble instruments. But some of the big guns in the speaker world have less of this variability. Note that refinement isn't free, and again can be hard to notice for some listeners without comparison. Let's summarize. The T+A Criterion S240 does the big things right. In fact, at this price point, it comes as close to getting all the big things right as any speaker I've heard. And any shortfalls in the little things will be minor or irrelevant for many listeners who are music lovers first. If this price range is manageable for you, this is a speaker you should hear ASAP. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the T+A Criterion S240 loudspeaker. We invite you to watch our other videos, and we hope to see you again soon.